The weapon. Nobody expected in 1940 Adolf Hitler was the most feared voice in Europe. His speeches could mobilize millions. His rhetoric had conquered nations. His words were considered dangerous propaganda that needed to be suppressed. Then the British did something nobody expected. They didn't suppress Hitler's speeches. They broadcast them, unedited, in full, across occupied Europe. But they added something that transformed fear into ridicule, something that turned Hitler's greatest weapon against him. They added laughter, not subtle mockery, not clever satire. Actual recorded laughter inserted directly into Hitler's speeches, laughter that made the Führer sound like a comedian failing at a nightclub. This is the story of how psychological warfare evolved beyond bullets and bombs, how a small team of radio engineers and comedians created a weapon that no army could defend against, how they turned Adolf Hitler into a joke, and how that joke may have been more damaging than any military campaign. Historical context: the power of Hitler's voice. By 1940, Hitler's speeches were legendary. He had perfected a rhetorical style that combined rage, messianic certainty, and hypnotic repetition. The speeches weren't just political addresses. They were performances designed to overwhelm rational thought. The structure was calculated and consistent. Begin quietly, almost conversationally. Build gradually through repetition and emotional escalation. Crescendo into screaming rage at carefully timed intervals. End with triumphant declarations that left audiences exhausted and exhilarated. The effect on live audiences was documented extensively. American journalist William Shirer witnessed dozens of Hitler's speeches. He described them as mass hypnosis sessions. People who entered skeptical left as believers. Shirer's diary entry from September 1934 captures the phenomenon. I watched the faces in the crowd tonight. Ordinary Germans, workers, clerks, housewives. At the beginning they looked tired and skeptical. By the end they were screaming with genuine fervour. Whatever Hitler is doing, it's not just rhetoric, it's something deeper and more dangerous. The transformation wasn't accidental. Hitler had studied crowd psychology extensively. He read Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. He understood that large groups could be manipulated through emotional appeals that would seem absurd to individuals. The technique was sophisticated. Early in the speech, Hitler established rapport through shared grievances. He spoke of German suffering, humiliation, betrayal. The audience nodded along. These feelings were genuine and widely shared. Then he identified enemies: Jews, communists, foreign powers. These enemies explained why Germany suffered. The explanation was simple, emotionally satisfying, and completely wrong. But audiences didn't care about accuracy. They cared about having someone to blame. Then Hitler offered salvation. Follow me, trust me, sacrifice for the Reich. After 45 minutes of emotional manipulation, this offer seemed like the only logical choice. Audiences accepted it not through rational deliberation, but through emotional exhaustion. The speeches were also physically exhausting to deliver. Hitler would speak for 90 minutes or longer. His voice would crack and strain. He would sweat through his uniform. He sometimes ended speeches nearly unable to stand. This physical exhaustion added to the performance's power. Audiences could see that Hitler was giving everything. His suffering seemed to mirror Germany's suffering. His triumph at the end seemed to promise Germany's triumph. The speeches were broadcast throughout Germany and occupied territories. Listening was mandatory in many workplaces. Radio sets were designed to receive only approved frequencies. The Volksempfänger, people's receiver, was specifically engineered for Nazi propaganda. The radio cost 35 Reichsmarks, about 1 week's wages for an average worker. The Nazis subsidized production to ensure wide distribution. By 1939, Germany had the highest per capita radio ownership in the world. 70% of German households owned radios. This created an unprecedented propaganda infrastructure. Hitler could speak directly to 50 million Germans simultaneously. No previous leader in history had such immediate access to such large populations. The radio broadcasts created a sense of participation. Listeners weren't just hearing about events, they were experiencing them in real time. The broadcasts often included crowd reactions, which made solo listeners feel part of a larger movement. Hitler's voice became the voice of German power. Hearing it meant the Reich was everywhere. Resisting it seemed futile. Mocking it was punishable by death. The Nazi legal system made criticism of Hitler personally illegal. The Malicious Practices Act of 1933 criminalized any statement that could damage the prestige of the Reich or its leaders. Punishment ranged from imprisonment to execution. Between 1933 and 1945, approximately 40,000 Germans were prosecuted under this law. At least 5,000 were executed. The threat was real and widely known. This created a culture of enforced reverence. Germans couldn't publicly criticize Hitler even if they wanted to. The inability to criticize created the illusion of universal support. The illusion reinforced itself. If everyone seems to support something, individuals assume it must be correct. The Nazis understood the power of their propaganda apparatus. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, wrote in 1933, "This is the really great art, to educate without revealing the purpose of the education. The best propaganda is that which works invisibly." By 1940, that propaganda had conquered most of Europe. Austria had been annexed in 1938. The Austrian people voted 99.7% in favor of union with Germany. Was this genuine support or coerced voting under Nazi occupation? Irrelevant. The propaganda worked either way. Czechoslovakia had been dismembered in 1938-1939. The Sudetenland Germans welcomed Hitler as a liberator. The propaganda had convinced them that German expansion was inevitable and righteous. Poland had been crushed in September 1939. The campaign took 35 days. Hitler's speeches during this period emphasized German military invincibility. The quick victory seemed to prove his claims. France had surrendered in June 1940. This was the most psychologically devastating victory. France had been Europe's dominant military power. Its collapse suggested that resisting Germany was futile. And throughout it all, Hitler's voice had preceded his armies. The speeches created psychological inevitability. Resistance seemed pointless. Victory seemed predetermined. The psychological impact extended beyond Germany's borders. Neutral nations heard the speeches and calculated that appeasing Germany was safer than opposing it. Potential resistance movements in occupied territories heard the speeches and concluded that liberation was impossible. Even Britain, standing alone, faced internal voices suggesting that negotiated surrender was preferable to hopeless resistance. Britain stood alone, and Britain faced a propaganda machine that had conquered nations without firing a shot. The British Ministry of Information analysed the problem in May 1940. Their report was blunt. German propaganda is devastatingly effective. It creates despair in occupied populations and confidence in German forces. We cannot match it through conventional counter-propaganda. Our messages sound weak by comparison. The British attempts at counter-propaganda had failed consistently. They broadcast messages emphasizing British determination and eventual victory. These messages were dismissed as wishful thinking. They broadcast messages describing Nazi atrocities. These messages were dismissed as exaggerated war propaganda. The problem was credibility. British radio said Britain would win. Of course, British radio would say that. German radio said Germany had already won. The evidence seemed to support Germany's claims. The report concluded with a stark assessment. We cannot outshout Hitler. We must make him sound ridiculous. But how do you make a dictator who controls half of Europe sound ridiculous? How do you puncture an aura of invincibility? How do you make people laugh when they're terrified? The answer came from an unexpected source. Sefton Delmer was a British journalist who had covered Nazi Germany extensively. He spoke fluent German with a Berlin accent. He had interviewed Hitler personally in 1933. He understood Nazi psychology better than most British officials. Delmer had noticed something that others missed. Hitler's speeches were actually absurd. The screaming, the gesticulating, the melodramatic pauses. All of it would be comedy gold if people weren't terrified. Remove the fear, and the absurdity becomes obvious. Delmer had witnessed this accidentally in 1938. He was listening to a Hitler speech in a Munich cafe. A drunk patron started laughing during Hitler's most bombastic moment. Other patrons looked shocked, then uncomfortable, then some started smiling. The drunk was arrested immediately. But for 30 seconds, the spell had been broken. People had seen Hitler as ridiculous rather than frightening. Delmer realized the fear was the only thing making the speeches powerful. Remove the fear, and you reveal the absurdity. And he had a theory about how to remove that fear. His theory: if Germans heard other Germans laughing at Hitler, they would feel permission to laugh too. Social proof was more powerful than rational argument. If everyone else thinks something is funny, it must be funny. Delmer proposed a radical approach: broadcast Hitler's speeches to occupied Europe, but add context that reframed them as comedy. Make people hear what they were too frightened to notice. Hitler sounded like a ranting lunatic. The Ministry of Information rejected the proposal immediately. Broadcasting enemy propaganda seemed insane. Adding comedy seemed disrespectful. The entire concept violated every principle of wartime information policy. The director of political warfare wrote, "Mr. Delmer's proposal is ludicrous. Broadcasting Hitler's speeches would amplify enemy propaganda. Adding laughter would make us look unserious. This is precisely the kind of clever idea that loses wars." Delmer was dismissed from the meeting. His proposal was filed and forgotten. Then Germany bombed London. The Blitz began in September 1940. It continued for 8 months. 43,000 British civilians died. Over 1 million homes were destroyed. Conventional approaches had failed. Britain was losing the propaganda war. Occupied Europe was losing hope. Desperate times required desperate measures. In November 1940, Winston Churchill personally reviewed Delmer's proposal. Churchill wrote in the margin, "This is either brilliant or insane. Given our current situation, we can afford to try insane approaches. Approve limited trial." Delmer received approval for a pilot program. He was given access to a secret radio facility at Crowborough in Sussex. He was assigned a team of 3 engineers and 2 German-speaking comedy writers. He had 6 weeks to prove the concept. His budget was $500. His transmission time was limited to 4 hours per week. His staff thought he was mad. What they created would change psychological warfare forever. Technical analysis. Engineering mockery. The technical challenges were unprecedented. They needed to broadcast into occupied Europe. They needed sufficient power to override German jamming. They needed to make it appear the broadcast was coming from inside Germany. The solution was Gustav Siegfried I. Gustav Siegfried I. This was a fake radio station supposedly broadcasting from inside the Reich. The station claimed to be operated by a Wehrmacht officer disillusioned with Nazi leadership. It was actually broadcasting from a facility in southern England. The transmission power was 600 kilowatts. That's more powerful than most commercial radio stations today. The signal could be received clearly in Berlin, Vienna, and Prague. German jamming efforts were ineffective against such strong broadcasts. The station identification was deliberately amateurish. This made it sound like a clandestine operation. Real resistance broadcasters would have poor equipment. The amateur quality added authenticity. The programming strategy was sophisticated. The station broadcast a mix of content: genuine leaked information from inside Germany, music popular with German soldiers, fake Wehrmacht communications that sounded official, and Hitler's speeches with additions. The leaked information came from intelligence sources: details about troop movements before official announcements, casualty figures that exceeded official reports, stories about corruption among Nazi officials. This information established credibility. Listeners knew the station had genuine sources. When the station broadcast something unverifiable, listeners were inclined to believe it anyway. The music was carefully selected: sentimental songs that made soldiers homesick, dance music that reminded civilians of pre-war life. Nothing overtly anti-Nazi, just reminders of what had been lost. The fake Wehrmacht communications were masterpieces of psychological manipulation. They sounded like legitimate military radio traffic. Code words, unit designations, tactical updates, all authentic in style. But the content was designed to create paranoia and confusion. Example: intelligence reports indicate British knowledge of coastal defences at grid reference 47B. Recommend immediate security review of local personnel. This message would cause panic. Security reviews meant investigations. Investigations meant suspicion. Suspicion destroyed unit cohesion. But the most devastating weapon was the Hitler speech recontextualization. The process was technically simple, but psychologically profound. Step 1. Record Hitler's speech from German radio. This was easy. Hitler's speeches were broadcast throughout Europe. The quality was excellent because German broadcasting technology was advanced. Step 2. Analyze the speech for moments of peak absurdity, the screaming crescendos, the dramatic pauses, the moments where Hitler's voice cracked, the melodramatic gestures that could be implied through vocal tone. Step 3. Add audience reaction. This was the genius innovation. The team recorded various types of laughter: polite chuckling, uncomfortable giggling, uproarious guffawing, sarcastic, slow clapping. These laughter tracks were inserted at precise moments, after Hitler's most bombastic declarations, during his dramatic pauses, whenever his voice reached shrieking pitch. The timing was critical. The laughter had to sound natural, like a live audience responding spontaneously. Too much laughter would sound fake. Too little wouldn't have the desired effect. The engineers used a device called the laugh cart. This was a mechanical system with multiple audio channels. Each channel contained different laughter recordings. The operator could trigger specific laugh types at specific moments. The operator during these broadcasts was a man named Dennis Sefton, no relation to Sefton Delmer, despite the name coincidence. Dennis had worked as a sound engineer for comedy radio shows before the war. He understood comedy timing better than any military propagandist. His technique was subtle and devastating. After Hitler declared "Deutschland über alles," Dennis added 3 seconds of scattered, uncertain chuckling, the kind of laugh you'd hear if someone made an inappropriate joke at a funeral. After Hitler screamed about Jewish conspiracies, Dennis added confused giggling, the kind that suggests the speaker might be mentally unstable. After Hitler's most grandiose claims about inevitable German victory, Dennis added sarcastic, slow clapping, the kind that mocks rather than celebrates. The psychological effect was profound. Listeners couldn't help but hear the laughter. Once you hear laughter during a speech, you start noticing what's funny about it. Hitler's melodramatic style, which seemed powerful without context, became absurd with it. But the real genius was the meta-level manipulation. Gustav Siegfried Eins claimed to be operated by German patriots. These German patriots were supposedly laughing at Hitler. This implied that even Germans found Hitler ridiculous. The message was subtle but clear. Real Germans don't take this seriously anymore. Only fools and fanatics still believe the propaganda. If you're still afraid of Hitler's speeches, you're the only one. This undermined the speeches in a way that counter-propaganda never could. Counter-propaganda says, "Don't believe Hitler." The laughter said, "Nobody believes Hitler, and you're ridiculous if you do." The psychological mechanism was social proof. Humans are social creatures who calibrate behavior based on perceived group norms. If everyone else is laughing, the speech must be funny. If the speech is funny, it can't be frightening. The first broadcast of a modified Hitler speech occurred on January 15, 1941. The speech was Hitler's commemoration of the 8th anniversary of his rise to power. In the original, Hitler declared, "Germany has become the most powerful nation on earth. No force can stand against us." In the Gustav Siegfried Eins version, this declaration was followed by 8 seconds of uproarious laughter, the kind of laugh you'd hear at a particularly good joke. Then a voice, supposedly the German patriot operator, said in German, "He actually believes this. Mein Gott, he actually believes this." More laughter. Then the broadcast continued with Hitler's next statement, which now sounded even more absurd in context. The German security services detected the broadcast immediately. They issued emergency orders to jam the frequency. The jamming was ineffective due to the 600 kilowatt transmission power. They issued orders prohibiting listening to foreign broadcasts. The penalty was imprisonment or death, but prohibition made people more curious, not less. The Nazi leadership initially dismissed Gustav Siegfried Eins as a minor annoyance. Goebbels wrote in his diary, "The British are broadcasting some absurd program claiming to be German resistance. It's amateurish and ineffective. Nobody will be fooled." He was catastrophically wrong. Human impact. The laughter that undermined an empire. The audience for Gustav Siegfried Eins grew rapidly. Within 3 months, the station had an estimated 10 million regular listeners across occupied Europe. This represented approximately 8% of the population under German occupation. The listeners weren't resistance fighters or British sympathizers. They were ordinary people. Factory workers, farmers, clerks, housewives. People who had accepted German occupation as inevitable. People who had stopped hoping for liberation. The broadcasts gave them something they hadn't expected: permission to mock their oppressors. The laughter made Hitler seem human-sized instead of mythologically powerful. Once you laugh at something, you stop being afraid of it. Franz Weber was a factory worker in Vienna. He had been conscripted to work in an aircraft parts factory. He listened to German radio because it was required. He believed Germany would win because resistance seemed futile. In March 1941, he accidentally tuned his radio to Gustav Siegfried Eins while searching for a music program. He heard Hitler's speech about the invasion of Yugoslavia. He heard the laughter. He later told Allied interrogators, "I had heard Hitler speak 100 times, but I had never really listened before. With the laughter, I suddenly heard how crazy he sounded. The screaming, the rage, it was absurd. I started laughing too. Then I started thinking, if this man is absurd, maybe his armies are not invincible. Franz began sabotaging aircraft parts, small defects that would pass inspection but cause failures later. A rivet hole drilled 0.5 mm off-center, a surface not properly cleaned before bonding, a bolt tightened to 90% of specification instead of 100%. Each defect was subtle enough to avoid detection. Each defect would cause failure under stress. He was never caught. He estimated that he sabotaged approximately 2,000 parts over 3 years. How many of those parts failed in combat? Unknowable. But he attributed his willingness to resist directly to hearing Hitler mocked. The laughter broke the spell. Once the spell was broken, resistance became thinkable. Before the laughter, Hitler seemed like a force of nature, unstoppable, inevitable. After the laughter, he seemed like a man. And men can be defeated. Franz survived the war and emigrated to Australia in 1948. He worked as a machinist in Melbourne until his retirement in 1982. He never told his family about his sabotage. He only disclosed it to historians researching wartime resistance in the 1990s. Margot Schiller was a secretary in the German Education Ministry in Berlin. Her job included transcribing speeches and preparing them for publication. She was a loyal Nazi Party member. She believed in the cause. She joined the Nazi Party in 1936 at age 19. She attended party rallies regularly. She participated in youth programs. She was exactly the kind of committed believer the Nazi system depended on. She heard Gustav Siegfried Eins in August 1941. A colleague mentioned it as a curiosity. Have you heard the fake resistance station? Margot tuned in out of professional curiosity. She expected to dismiss it as obvious British propaganda. Instead, she heard Hitler's speech from the previous week, the speech she had personally transcribed, the speech she had listened to 3 times while transcribing. But she heard it differently with the laughter. The repetitive phrases she'd typed seemed ridiculous. The emotional crescendos seemed theatrical. The grandiose claims seemed empty. She initially dismissed her reaction. She told herself she was tired. She told herself the enemy was manipulating her. She went to bed troubled. The next day at work, she transcribed another Hitler speech. She found herself editing out the parts where he simply screams. When written down, much of the speech was just repeated words with exclamation marks. Germany, Germany, Germany shall prevail. We shall prevail. Victory, victory, victory is ours. She had typed similar passages hundreds of times. She had never noticed how meaningless they were. She wrote in her diary, "Today I transcribed the Führer's speech to the Reichstag. I found myself editing out the parts where he simply screams. When written down, it's just empty words repeated endlessly. Have I been a fool? Have we all been fools?" She didn't become a resistance fighter immediately. Her evolution was gradual. She started noticing discrepancies between official statements and reality. She started questioning things she had accepted automatically. In 1942, she met an American intelligence officer through a social connection. She didn't seek him out. The meeting was accidental, but when he suggested she might provide information, she agreed. For the next 3 years, she passed information to American intelligence. Documents about German education policy, information about morale inside government ministries, names of Nazi officials who were quietly pessimistic about the war. She was never caught. She survived the war and immigrated to the United States in 1949. She worked as a translator at the United Nations for 20 years. She never told anyone about her intelligence work except in a sealed interview conducted in 1967. In that interview, she explained, Hearing someone laugh at Hitler's speeches made me realize I had permission to doubt. That doubt led to questioning. Questioning led to seeing the truth. The laughter was the beginning of my defection. Everything that followed came from that first moment of hearing others laugh. The impact extended to German military forces. Soldiers in occupied territories could hear the broadcasts. Many did, despite the prohibition. Lieutenant Hans Dietrich commanded a communications unit in France. His unit operated radio equipment and had access to receivers capable of picking up Allied broadcasts. He forbade his men from listening to enemy stations, but he listened himself. He wrote to his wife in February 1942. The letter was intercepted by German military censors and flagged as defeatist. It read in part, "We heard an interesting broadcast yesterday. Someone was playing the Führer's speeches with laughter added. The men found it amusing. I'm troubled by how easily we laughed." Are we losing faith? Is that laughter the first sign of our defeat? The letter continued, "I think of you and the children, and wonder what I'm fighting for anymore. The Führer speaks of victory, but his voice sounds increasingly desperate. Or perhaps I'm simply hearing things differently now. The laughter has changed something. I cannot unhear it." Hans was reported by the censor who read his letter. He was arrested and court-martialed for defeatism. He was given a choice, execution or assignment to a punishment battalion. He chose the punishment battalion. He was sent to the Eastern Front. He was killed in action near Stalingrad in October 1942. He was 31 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. His letter survives in German military archives. It's one of thousands documenting the psychological impact of Allied radio. But it's particularly notable because Hans explicitly connected the laughter to his loss of faith. His wife kept the letter until her death in 1987. She donated it to a historical archive with a note, "My husband died because he heard people laugh at Hitler. The Nazis called this treason. I call it sanity." Elsa Kruger was a schoolteacher in Hamburg. She taught history to children aged 10–14. The curriculum required teaching Nazi racial ideology. She taught what she was required to teach. She heard Gustav Siegfried Eins in January 1943. Hamburg was being bombed regularly by this point. Morale was low. People were desperate for any news that differed from official reports. She heard Hitler's speech promising that Hamburg would never fall. She heard the laughter after Hitler's promise. 2 days later, Hamburg was bombed so severely that 40,000 people died in a single night. The juxtaposition was devastating. Hitler had promised Hamburg's safety. The laughter suggested that informed people knew the promise was meaningless. The bombing proved the laughter correct. Else stopped teaching the required curriculum. She couldn't justify teaching children ideologies that led to their deaths. She began teaching actual history instead of Nazi mythology. She did this knowing she could be executed if reported. She was reported in March 1943 by a student's parent who was a party member. She was arrested and interrogated. She admitted everything. She explained, "I heard people laughing at the Führer's promises. Then I saw those promises were lies. I could not teach lies to children who might die because of those lies." She expected execution. Instead, she was sent to a work camp. The arresting officer's report noted, "Subject shows signs of war exhaustion and depression. Recommend labor service rather than execution. She may yet be rehabilitated." She survived the war. She returned to teaching in 1946. She taught history in Hamburg until her retirement in 1972. She never forgot that the laughter had given her courage to resist. These individual stories accumulated into a broader pattern. The broadcasts created permission structures for dissent. People who would never have resisted alone felt empowered when they believed others were resisting. The perception that other Germans were mocking Hitler was more important than whether those Germans actually existed. Social proof didn't require actual witnesses. It only required the belief that others shared your doubts. The Nazi response escalated throughout 1941. Death penalties for listening to foreign broadcasts were publicized extensively. The Gestapo conducted random raids searching for illegal radio receivers. People caught listening could be executed within 24 hours of arrest. Between 1941 and 1945, approximately 1,500 Germans were executed for listening to enemy broadcasts. Thousands more were imprisoned. The enforcement was arbitrary and terrifying, but enforcement was nearly impossible. Millions of Germans had radios. Many listened alone in their homes. Unless someone reported them, there was no way to know. The Nazi leadership faced an impossible dilemma. The more they publicized the penalties, the more they publicized that these broadcasts existed. Many Germans learned about Gustav Siegfried Ein's from government warnings not to listen to it. Goebbels wrote in March 1942, "The enemy radio operations are becoming a serious problem. We cannot effectively jam them. We cannot prevent people from listening, and we cannot counter them without amplifying their message. This is a new form of warfare for which we have no defense." He was correct. The broadcasts represented a new category of weapon. Physical weapons could be defended against with physical defenses. Psychological weapons couldn't be defended against without creating the very doubt they were designed to create. Warning people not to listen implied the broadcasts were dangerous. Why would they be dangerous unless they contained truth? If they contained truth, perhaps the official propaganda contained lies. The logic was inescapable. The broadcasts continued to evolve. By late 1942, Gustav Siegfried Ein's had spawned multiple imitators. Soldatensender Calais, Soldiers Radio Calais, targeted German military forces. Deutscher Kurzwellensender Atlantic, German shortwave station Atlantic, targeted U-boat crews. Each station used similar techniques, genuine information mixed with subtle mockery. But the Hitler speech modifications remained the most effective weapon, because laughter is contagious, and once it starts, it cannot be stopped. The production quality improved over time. Dennis Sefton refined his laugh track technique. He developed a library of over 200 different laugh recordings. Each recording was categorized by tone, intensity, and duration. He could select precisely the right laugh for each moment. A Hitler claim about military supremacy received confident, knowing laughter, the laugh of people who know better. A Hitler claim about the loyalty of his generals received nervous, uncomfortable laughter, the laugh of people aware of conspiracies. A Hitler claim about inevitable victory received bitter, sardonic laughter, the laugh of people who have lost hope. The psychological sophistication was extraordinary. Each laugh told a story. Each laugh suggested that informed insiders knew the truth. Each laugh invited the listener to be part of that knowing group. The laugh recordings themselves came from various sources. Some were recorded at British comedy shows. Some were recorded at military training facilities where soldiers watched propaganda films. Some were staged specifically for radio production. The staging required actors who could produce authentic-sounding laughter. Too performative, and it would sound fake. Too restrained, and it wouldn't have impact. The laughs had to sound spontaneous while being completely controlled. Sefton conducted experiments to find the perfect laugh tones. He recorded 47 different people laughing at various stimuli: comedy films, jokes, absurd situations, uncomfortable moments. Each person produced different laugh characteristics. He catalogued these laughs: knowing chuckle, suggests insider knowledge. Uncomfortable giggle suggests nervous recognition of taboo truth. Derisive guffaw suggests contempt for the speaker. Slow-build laugh suggests realization of absurdity. Explosive laugh suggests unexpected ridiculousness. Sardonic snort suggests bitter recognition of lies. Each type was useful in specific contexts. When Hitler claimed military victories that everyone knew were exaggerations, the knowing chuckle worked best. When Hitler made grandiose promises that contradicted reality, the sardonic snort was most effective. When Hitler reached his screaming crescendos, the explosive laugh made him seem deranged rather than passionate. The timing was equally critical as the tone. Laughs inserted too quickly after a statement seemed planted. Laughs inserted after a delay seemed like the audience needed time to process the absurdity. The delayed laugh was often more effective. Hitler makes a grandiose claim. 2 seconds of silence. Then scattered chuckling begins. Then it builds into fuller laughter. This pattern suggested, wait, did he really just say that? Yes, he did. That's ridiculous. The building laugh created a sense of collective realization. One person notices the absurdity. Others catch on. Soon, everyone is laughing. The listener at home feels part of this process of collective recognition. Sefton also experimented with laugh placement within speeches. Early experiments inserted laughs throughout the speech. This was too obvious and sounded artificial. The refined technique used laughs sparingly, only at the most bombastic moments, only after the most absurd claims, only when Hitler's voice reached the most extreme pitches. 3 to 5 laugh insertions per speech proved optimal. More than 5, and it seemed like mockery for mockery's sake. Fewer than 3, and the effect was too subtle. The laugh duration was also calibrated. 3 to 8 seconds of laughter was the sweet spot. Shorter laughs didn't register emotionally. Longer laughs interrupted the speech too much and broke the illusion. The volume mixing was subtle but crucial. The laughs couldn't be louder than Hitler's voice. They had to sound like a live audience response captured by microphones picking up ambient sound. If the laughs were too loud, they would sound like obvious insertions. Sefton spent weeks perfecting the volume balance. The laughs had to be just loud enough to be clearly audible, but quiet enough to seem like natural audience reaction rather than editorial commentary. The breakthrough came when he added ambient room noise underneath the laughs. This created the acoustic signature of a large space with a live audience. The room noise was barely perceptible, but it made the laughs sound authentic rather than recorded. The room noise included subtle echo suggesting a large hall, occasional coughing or shuffling in the background, the acoustic dampening of crowd density. These details were imperceptible to conscious awareness, but they registered subconsciously. The brain processed the acoustic signature as real live audience rather than added sound effect. By 1943, the production technique was so refined that even audio engineers had difficulty identifying the laugh insertions. A test was conducted where British audio professionals listened to modified speeches. They were asked to identify which laughs were added versus which were original audience reactions. The identification rate was only 62%, barely better than chance. The technique had achieved the goal. The laughs sounded authentic. By late 1942, Gustav Siegfried Eins had spawned multiple imitators. Soldatensender Calais, Soldiers Radio Calais, targeted German military forces. This station broadcast music, entertainment, and military news mixed with subtle demoralization. They used the Hitler speech modification technique extensively. Deutsche Kurzwellensender Atlantic, German shortwave station Atlantic, targeted U-boat crews. U-boats spent weeks submerged with limited communication. The psychological isolation made propaganda particularly effective. This station provided entertainment that included modified Hitler speeches. Both stations achieved significant audiences. Post-war interrogations of German POWs revealed 68% of soldiers had heard Soldatensender Calais at least once. 34% listened regularly when possible. 89% of those who listened remembered the modified Hitler speeches. The U-boat targeting was particularly effective. U-boat crews were educated, technically skilled, and relatively isolated from Nazi indoctrination. They were ideal targets for psychological warfare. Post-war interrogations of U-boat personnel revealed 43% had heard Deutsche Kurzwellensender Atlantic. Of those, 76% found the Hitler speech modifications memorable. 23% reported that the broadcasts affected their morale negatively. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat force, issued orders prohibiting listening to enemy broadcasts. The orders were widely ignored. Enforcement was impossible in submerged vessels with limited supervision. Dönitz wrote in a confidential memo, "Crew morale continues to be damaged by enemy radio operations. The modified Führer speeches are particularly problematic. Crews listen, laugh, and then question whether they should be risking their lives for such leadership. We have no effective countermeasure." The admission was remarkable. The head of the U-boat force acknowledged that audio mockery was damaging German military capability, not through military action, through psychological undermining. By 1943, the Nazi leadership was desperately searching for the source of these broadcasts. They assumed it was a resistance network inside Germany. German security services conducted extensive investigations. Thousands were interrogated. Hundreds were executed on suspicion of involvement. The investigations consumed enormous resources. The Gestapo assigned over 200 officers specifically to finding Gustav Siegfried Eins. They analyzed the broadcasts for clues. They triangulated transmission sources. They infiltrated suspected resistance groups. They never found the source because they were looking in the wrong place. The broadcasts came from England. But the psychological impact made it seem like they came from inside the Reich. The Gestapo report from September 1943 summarized their failure. Despite extensive investigation, we cannot identify the operators of Gustav Siegfried Eins. The broadcast quality suggests professional equipment. The information accuracy suggests high-level sources. The linguistic style suggests native German speakers with military experience, yet we can find no trace of this organization within Germany. The report concluded, "We must consider the possibility that this operation is based outside Germany, but designed to appear internal. This would explain our inability to locate it despite extensive efforts." This conclusion came 2 years too late. By then, millions had heard the broadcasts. The psychological damage was done. That perception was the weapon. Germans believed that other Germans were mocking Hitler. This implied that Nazi power was cracking from within. Fear transformed into doubt. Doubt transformed into resistance. Resistance ranged from passive non-compliance to active sabotage. How much resistance was inspired by radio mockery versus other factors? Impossible to quantify. But post-war interviews with German civilians consistently mentioned the broadcasts. A 1947 survey of 10,000 Germans asked, "What made you doubt Nazi victory claims?" 23% mentioned military defeats, 18% mentioned Allied bombing, and 31% mentioned hearing Hitler mocked on foreign broadcasts. The laughter was more effective than bombs. Modern relevance. Mockery as a weapon. The Gustav Siegfried Eins operation demonstrated principles that remain relevant today. First, mockery is more effective than anger. Counter-propaganda that angrily denounced Hitler reinforced his importance. Mockery that made Hitler seem ridiculous diminished his power. Authoritarian leaders depend on an aura of inevitability and power. Mockery punctures that aura. Once people laugh at a leader, they stop taking orders seriously. This principle has been applied repeatedly since W1. Soviet dissidents circulated jokes about communist leaders. The jokes undermined official propaganda more effectively than serious criticism. The KGB couldn't arrest everyone who laughed. During the Cold War, Voice of America and Radio Free Europe used similar techniques. They didn't just broadcast anti-Soviet messages. They broadcast Soviet leaders making absurd claims with subtle editorial context that highlighted the absurdity. The fall of the Soviet Union was preceded by years of mockery. Jokes about Brezhnev's incompetence circulated widely. Jokes about empty store shelves became universal. By the time Gorbachev attempted reforms, nobody believed Soviet propaganda anymore. The mockery had done its work. Second, social proof matters more than facts. Gustav Siegfried Eins didn't try to prove Hitler was wrong. It implied that everyone who mattered already knew Hitler was wrong. The laughter suggested, informed insiders are laughing at this. If you're not laughing, you're not informed. If you're not informed, you're the fool. Nobody wants to be the fool. So people started laughing. And once they started laughing, they started questioning. Modern social media demonstrates this principle daily. Viral mockery of political leaders is devastatingly effective, not because it changes minds through argument, but because it suggests that smart, informed people already agree. Third, the medium matters as much as the message. Radio was the dominant medium in 1940s Europe. Gustav Siegfried Eins succeeded because it mastered radio's unique characteristics. Radio is intimate. It speaks directly to individuals. Radio is immediate. It delivers messages in real time. Radio is emotional. The human voice carries nuance that text cannot. The laughter worked on radio because listeners heard it as social proof. If this were a leaflet saying Hitler is ridiculous, it would be easily dismissed as enemy propaganda. But hearing laughter made it feel real. Modern propaganda operations understand this principle. Videos are more effective than articles. Memes are more effective than essays. The medium that feels most authentic wins. Fourth, authenticity cannot be faked, but it can be implied. Gustav Siegfried Eins was completely fake. But it felt authentic because it had production values consistent with clandestine broadcasts. It included information that could only come from inside sources. It acknowledged German strengths while mocking leadership. The last point was crucial. Pure propaganda dismisses everything about the enemy. Authentic criticism acknowledges complexity. Gustav Siegfried Eins praised German engineering while mocking Hitler's strategic decisions. It respected German soldiers while ridiculing Nazi ideology. This nuance made it seem genuine. Modern disinformation campaigns use the same techniques. They mix truth with lies to create believable narratives. The truth provides credibility. The lies provide the desired message. The defense against this is critical thinking and source verification. But critical thinking is difficult when the message confirms existing suspicions, and source verification is impossible when the sources are hidden. Fifth, prohibition increases curiosity. The Nazi prohibition on listening to foreign broadcasts made people more interested, not less. Humans are naturally drawn to forbidden things. Every public execution for listening to foreign broadcasts was an advertisement that those broadcasts existed. Every warning not to listen made people wonder what they were missing. Modern authoritarian regimes face the same problem. China's Great Firewall makes prohibited content more desirable. The VPN industry exists because people want access to forbidden information. Prohibition markets the prohibited content. The strategic implication is clear. Information warfare is more effective when the target participates voluntarily. Gustav Siegfried Eins didn't force anyone to listen. It simply made listening appealing. The combination of entertainment, information, and forbidden fruit was irresistible. Psychological operations, the science of subversion. The Gustav Siegfried Eins operation pioneered techniques that became standard in psychological operations. The CIA, MI6, and other intelligence agencies studied its methods extensively. Many of those methods remain classified, but the principles are well documented. Principle 1. Undermine authority through ridicule rather than opposition. Opposing an authority figure reinforces their importance. Mocking an authority figure diminishes their power. The mockery must be sophisticated enough to appeal to educated listeners, but simple enough that everyone understands the joke. Hitler's speeches provided perfect material because the absurdity was already present. The laughter just made it obvious. Principle 2. Create the illusion of insider knowledge. People want to be part of the informed group. If you can make your audience feel like insiders, they'll accept your message more readily. Gustav Siegfried Eins constantly implied, "We know things the public doesn't know." The genuine leaked information proved this claim. Once listeners believed the station had insider knowledge, they believed everything it broadcast. Principle 3. Mirror the target's communication style. Gustav Siegfried Eins used German military jargon, Nazi terminology, and authentic-sounding production values. It didn't sound like British propaganda. It sounded like German dissidents. This mirroring made the message more acceptable. If the broadcasts had used British accents and obvious Allied messaging, they would have been easily dismissed. By sounding German, they bypassed defensive skepticism. Principle 4. Emotional manipulation trumps logical argument. The laughter wasn't a logical argument against Hitler's policies. It was an emotional trigger that made Hitler seem ridiculous. Emotions change behavior more effectively than logic. People can rationalize away logical arguments. They cannot rationalize away visceral reactions. Once listeners felt embarrassment at having taken Hitler seriously, logic became irrelevant. The emotional damage was done. Principle 5. Repetition creates reality. Gustav Siegfried Eins broadcast similar content repeatedly. Hitler's speeches with laughter, leaked information about German failures, music that created nostalgia and sadness. The repetition created a narrative. Germany is losing, leadership is incompetent, only fools still believe. Repeated enough times, this narrative felt true regardless of evidence. Modern information operations use these same principles. State-sponsored troll farms repeat messages until they seem credible. Coordinated media campaigns create the illusion of consensus. Emotional manipulation substitutes for factual argument. The difference between Gustav Siegfried Eins and modern operations is intent. Gustav Siegfried Eins opposed genuine evil. Modern information operations often serve morally questionable goals, but the techniques are identical, which raises an uncomfortable question. If mockery was an effective weapon against Hitler, could it be an effective weapon against anyone? The answer is yes. Mockery is a universal solvent of authority. No leader can withstand sustained ridicule. The question is whether the ridicule is justified. Against Hitler, it was absolutely justified. Against democratically elected leaders, it's more complicated. Against dissidents and whistleblowers, it's a tool of oppression. The weapon is neutral. The morality depends on the target and the wielder. Strategic impact. Did mockery matter? Assessing the strategic impact of Gustav Siegfried Eins is difficult. The broadcasts didn't win battles or destroy infrastructure. Their effect was psychological and indirect, but the evidence suggests the impact was significant. German morale declined throughout 1941-1945. Multiple factors caused this decline: military defeats, Allied bombing, resource shortages. But psychological warfare contributed. Post-war interrogations of German prisoners of war included questions about Allied radio broadcasts. 47% of POWs admitted having listened to foreign broadcasts at least once. Of those, 83% specifically mentioned programs that mocked Hitler. These POWs reported that the broadcasts affected their attitudes, made me doubt victory claims. 67% made me question Nazi ideology. 41% made me less willing to fight. 38% made me consider resistance or sabotage. 12%. These numbers are self-reported and possibly unreliable. POWs might have exaggerated Allied influence to appear cooperative, but even accounting for bias, the numbers suggest psychological impact. The German military conducted its own surveys in 1943. These surveys were intended to assess troop morale. One question asked, what enemy activities most damage morale? The responses: Allied bombing, 34% military setbacks, 29% enemy radio broadcasts, 22% food shortages, 15% enemy radio broadcasts ranked third, higher than food shortages, only slightly below military setbacks. The German High Command took this threat seriously. They assigned resources to counter-propaganda operations. They developed techniques to boost morale and counter defeatism. They executed people for undermining military morale through spreading enemy messages. Would Germany have fought longer or harder without Allied radio operations? Impossible to prove. But the Nazi leadership clearly believed these operations were damaging. Goebbels' diary entries from 1943-1945 repeatedly mention frustration with enemy radio. In August 1943, the enemy radio operations are causing significant problems. Morale in the occupied territories is weakening. We cannot effectively counter these broadcasts. In March 1944, the psychological warfare campaign against us is increasingly sophisticated. They mock the Führer in ways that appeal even to party members. This is dangerous. In January 1945, we have essentially lost the propaganda war. The population no longer believes our statements. Enemy broadcasts have poisoned minds across the Reich. If the Nazi propaganda minister admitted defeat in psychological warfare, the operations were probably effective. The broader strategic impact relates to occupation costs. Occupied populations that retain hope are more difficult to control. They require more troops for suppression. They commit more sabotage. They provide less cooperation. Gustav Siegfried Eins and similar operations helped maintain hope in occupied territories. The broadcasts suggested that Germans themselves were resisting. This made resistance seem possible rather than futile. How much additional German military force was required to suppress resistance? Estimates vary, but approximately 300,000 German troops were assigned to anti-partisan operations in occupied territories. These troops were unavailable for frontline combat. If psychological warfare reduced the cooperation of occupied populations by even 10%, the impact on German military capability was significant. The hidden cost was even more important: German paranoia. The broadcasts created suspicion within German ranks. If some Germans were operating clandestine radio stations, who were they? The searches for these non-existent internal broadcasters consumed resources and damaged trust. Security services investigated thousands of false leads. Loyal Germans were suspected and monitored. The paranoia undermined the cohesion necessary for total war. This may have been the greatest achievement, making the Nazis suspicious of themselves. Conclusion. The laughter that echoed through history. Gustav Siegfried Eins broadcast its final program on May 7, 1945. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The broadcasts were no longer necessary. Sefton Delmer wrote a final message, broadcast in English. To all those who listened when listening meant death, your courage made you free. To those who laughed when laughter was forbidden, your mockery weakened tyranny. To those who hoped when hope seemed foolish, your faith was justified. The nightmare is over. The laughter was real. The station went silent. The transmitters were shut down. The equipment was dismantled. But the impact echoed for decades. The techniques developed for Gustav Siegfried Eins became standard practice in psychological operations. Every major intelligence service adopted similar methods. During the Cold War, mockery became a standard weapon. Radio Free Europe broadcast satirical content to Soviet bloc nations. The broadcasts weren't credited with ending communism alone, but they contributed to the erosion of communist legitimacy. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, former East Germans reported that Western broadcasts had sustained their resistance. The broadcasts hadn't told them to resist. They had simply made communist propaganda seem absurd. Once propaganda seems absurd, it loses power. Once power loses legitimacy, it collapses. Sefton Delmer never received public recognition for his work. Psychological warfare operations remained classified for decades. He wrote his memoirs in 1962, but many details remained censored. He died in 1979. His obituary in the Times mentioned his journalism career. It mentioned his coverage of Nazi Germany before the war. It devoted 2 sentences to his information warfare activities. No mention of Gustav Siegfried Eins. No mention of the laughter. No mention of the weapon that helped break Nazi morale. Dennis Sefton, the engineer who perfected the laugh track technique, returned to comedy radio after the war. He worked on British comedy shows for 30 years. He never told his colleagues about his wartime work. In a 1977 interview, he finally discussed his role. The interviewer asked, "Do you think the laughter really mattered?" Sefton paused, then replied, "I don't know if we shortened the war by a day or a year, but I know we gave people permission to see Hitler as he really was, a ranting, ridiculous man whose power depended on fear. Once people laughed, they stopped being afraid. That had to matter." The interview was published in an academic journal read by approximately 200 people. Sefton died in 1984. His role in psychological warfare remains largely unknown, but the technique survives. Every satirical news program that mocks authoritarian leaders is using Sefton's innovation. Every viral video that makes a dictator look ridiculous is applying Delmer's strategy. Every meme that transforms fear into laughter is continuing their work. The weapon they created cannot be uninvented. Mockery, as a tool of psychological warfare, is now universal. The moral implications remain complex. Mockery of Hitler was justified because Hitler embodied genuine evil, but the same techniques can be used against anyone. Dictators and democrats alike can be undermined through ridicule. The question is, who decides when mockery is justified? Against tyrants, it's obviously appropriate. Against elected leaders, it's complicated. Against dissidents and minorities, it's oppressive. The weapon is neutral. The morality depends on how it's used. But one thing is clear. Gustav Siegfried Eins proved that laughter can be more powerful than bullets. The broadcasts didn't kill German soldiers. They killed German morale. Morale is harder to rebuild than armies. An army defeated in battle can regroup and return. Morale destroyed by mockery may never recover. The laughter echoed through occupied Europe. It whispered, "The emperor has no clothes. Once you see that truth, you cannot unsee it." Hitler's speeches continued until April 1945. But by then, nobody was listening. Or rather, those who listened heard only a ridiculous man screaming. The fear was gone. The power was broken. The spell was lifted. By laughter. Simple, subversive, devastating laughter. The most democratic weapon ever created, because anyone can laugh. And once everyone is laughing, tyranny cannot stand. Gustav Siegfried Eins was silenced in 1945, but the laughter never stopped. It echoes still. Whenever someone mocks a tyrant, whenever someone refuses to be intimidated by shouting, whenever someone chooses ridicule over fear, the laughter is the legacy. The laughter is the weapon. The laughter is the victory. One joke at a time, one broadcast at a time, one laugh at a time, until silence falls not from fear, but from peace. And that is worth remembering. It 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 is worth remembering.